There we go. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm delighted that we're recording, but also that we've got such wonderful people joining us. Just so you know, from the Netherlands and from Berlin and various other places more locally as well. It's always wonderful to have Nellie and Walter joining us as well, who have spoken about their Holocaust experiences many times within this synagogue, and we're delighted that you're able to join us. We're able to connect you this evening as well. As I said in all of my publicity to everybody, I'm totally biased, and at the same time not, because this book is brilliant. It really is quite marvellous. As I was reflecting before, publishing companies don't go out of the way to make books look so beautiful unless they really think that the material inside is really worth it. And this really is. So as well as being my first cousin, Dan is, which is the most important detail that you need to know. Dan Stone is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway University of London. And his fame spreads all over the place, so much so that just having a few days break in Folkestone, I happened to go into a wine bar, happened to have this out, and somebody behind the counter just said, "Oh, Dan Stone." So your fame spreads all over the place.
As far as Folkestone.
Yeah, no, very much so. But this is very much the evening for Dan to speak, not me to speak. I'll hopefully be able to moderate for everybody online as well. If you've got questions, please do. They're up there, by the way. If you do have questions, please, ideally, if you can put it into the chat. If you can't operate that and are desperate to speak, I know you'll wave quite manically, and hopefully I'll be able to pick you up. But Dan, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here and to see everybody. Well, as Aaron said, the book is beautiful, which of course I'm very happy about, but it's not a beautiful topic. That's also perfectly clear. So Aaron invited me to speak about the book, and so I will do, but it is, of course, not the most cheerful of subjects, but I guess if you attend a Holocaust memorial event, you know that's going to be the case. So the first thing I'll say is, everyone here knows there are a lot of books on the Holocaust. The scholarly literature, the popular literature, the films, the media, everything connected with the Holocaust, there's a lot of material. Why do we need another book? And it's I think, a perfectly valid question. But I would also say that it looks on first glance like a paradox that we have so many books already. Why do we need more? But actually, it's not a paradox. I think really it's a truism that the subjects that bother us the most are the ones that we write about the most. So with no disrespect to my colleagues who are medievalists and so on, I don't think the literature on, let's say, canal building in the 18th century or falconry in the 14th century is as enormous or as hotly contested as Holocaust studies is. And that's simply because those subjects don't affect us still as emotionally, politically, culturally as a topic like the Holocaust does and should hopefully continue to do. So the reality is that the more books that there are on a subject, the more there is to talk about. And the Third Reich lasted a mere 12 years, but the amount of material it left behind is truly gargantuan. It's extraordinary how much material there is. And that's because, one of the things I've tried to show in this book, the Holocaust was a continent-wide crime whose effects were felt worldwide. There are archives everywhere across the world that are relevant and contain information about what we now call the Holocaust. So we talk about it as if it were one thing. Actually, there's a huge variety of events and people and places involved in this thing that we talk about as the Holocaust. So that's why I've called it an unfinished history. It's unfinished in two respects. First of all, because it's my view that all history, in a sense, is contemporary history, by which I mean that the questions that we ask, the way that we write about the past is not set in stone, it's not fixed, it's always changing. And the world in which we live now I've been working on this subject for, how old am I? So at least 25 years. And so, and the way I think about it as a kind of knee-jerk, instinctive way is different now from the way I did 20, 25 years ago, not just because my own ideas have changed over time, but because the world that we live in has changed. And it feels different writing this book now than it did 5 or 10 years ago. In a world of Brexit, Trump, the rise of populism, the climate emergency, et cetera, the questions that I think are informing what academics write about the Holocaust and the way in which the rest of us then think about it are changing all the time. So first of all, of course, every generation wants to write its own version of the past to suit its own needs and questions. And secondly, those questions then are changing all the time. So it's unfinished in that sense. I'm under no illusion that this book obviously will also not be the last word on the subject. There shouldn't be a last word on the subject. There will be future books, and there already are, because the scholarly literature comes as a kind of tsunami. So it's developing all the time. Secondly, it's unfinished because the Holocaust itself is unfinished. And I don't mean that in some kind of pseudo-mystical sense. I mean that in a very real way, that of course the killing process ended with the demise of the Nazi regime in May 1945, but the after effects of the Holocaust continued in the lives of the survivors immediately thereafter and for the rest of their lives. Most of the survivors were ill physically or psychologically, and many of them remained so for the rest of their lives. Although there is also very interesting literature in psychology and in aging, which shows actually how Holocaust survivors, on the whole, tend to have a longer life expectancy than many people in their cohort, and also tend to cope remarkably well with the things that they've been through, in a sense. I mean, that's a very difficult topic, but well, I'll park that for the moment. But the Holocaust shaped the post-war world, not just for the lives of the survivors, but for the rest of the world as well. So if you think about the architecture of human rights that emerged after World War II, the United Nations Conventions on Human Rights, on the prevention and punishment of genocide, the UN Declaration on Death of Missing Persons, et cetera, the body that became what's today the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, all of these things emerged out of the post-war world and were shaped by the ways in which Holocaust survivors and other displaced persons were treated after World War II. So the very concepts that we now have of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and so on, are also all, to some extent, creations of a post-Holocaust world. We only have to look around and see that today the Holocaust remains a point of contention around the world. This is why I think the Holocaust is unfinished. It's a topic that continues to trouble all thinking people, as it should. The question as to why a state, not just a group of crazed thugs who demolish gravestones in an anti-Semitic attack, but why a state should take anti-Semitism to the heart of everything that it did, and to target a group of people because of their beliefs about their so-called racial origins, is something that I think is very deeply troubling for the way in which we think about the world, about who has the right to inhabit it, about different human groups, and the way in which we think about difference and otherness and sameness and identity and so on. These are extremely important topics, and the ways in which the Holocaust reverberates in our contemporary culture is still being felt all the time, not just in the slew of films or popular Bowdlerizations of the Holocaust. There are websites called things like Cats That Look Like Hitler and Houses That Look Like Hitler. I particularly recommend that one. It's very good, Houses That Look Like Hitler. But there are shops around the world in India and Russia and places selling clothing with all sorts of bizarre, not necessarily neo-Nazi, but bizarre representations of fascist leaders. Shops in Predapio, where Mussolini was born, selling beer bottles and wine bottles with his image or Hitler's image on. And of course, most egregiously, we look at Putin's claim to be denazifying Ukraine. We see that the memory of what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War is now being weaponized in a way to justify what's essentially a fascist act of aggression against another European sovereign state. So we see here how Holocaust memory continues to shape the world in which we live, and the ways in which this is being used to threaten and divide those who work on and think about the Holocaust is also troubling. Most Holocaust historians, what they know about Ukraine is that this is a place where indigenous collaborating movements like the OUN, Stepan Bandera's movement, attacked and killed Jews in collaboration with the Nazi regime because they hoped thereby that they would obtain a Ukrainian state. They realized, of course, quite soon that this was not going to happen, but in the meantime, they also were responsible for killing some tens of thousands of Jews in Ukraine. And Holocaust historians, I think, have had to think hard about how to position themselves with respect to what's going on, and to think, okay, we understand this about Ukraine historically, but here we see an inversion of everything that we know, and the attack on Ukraine cannot be justified as a form of denazification, even if there are reports of people in Lviv and elsewhere talking about making Bandera cocktails to throw at the Russians. There is, of course, a noisy neo-Nazi element in Ukraine, but I think no more than there is in any other European country. And the idea that Ukraine is a Nazi state is of course, an absurdity. So here we see this is something that has happened with respect to Holocaust memory in general, but in the case of Russia, we see an extreme version. That's to say, Holocaust memory, the narrative of Holocaust memory that we've become used to as a kind of form of cosmopolitanism, the advancement of human rights and so on, has been turned on its head in many places and in many different ways. But particularly with the Russian attack on Ukraine, you see a very conscious use of the language of anti-fascism, the memory of World War II, the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis being used to justify the attack on Ukraine. And that shows, I think, better than any other illustration that I can give, the fact that the Holocaust is still unfinished history. And this is something that we'll have to continue to think about, obviously, for some years to come. So I wanted to write this book because there have been, in recent years, some pretty hefty synthetic histories of the Holocaust by Christopher Browning, Peter Longerich, David Cesarani, my former colleague, Aurore Holloway, and others. But, you know, they're all 1,000-page books. They're not easy reading. And there are also some very short introductions to the Holocaust, which are quite good. But I thought, and there's a book, for example, Lawrence Rees's book on the Holocaust, which is also published by Penguin, is extremely good. It's a narrative account, but it's simply a narrative account, if you like. And I wanted to write something that was a bit more analytical. I think there is now enough of a general literature out there so that the intelligent general reader, you know, whatever that is, who already knows a little bit about the subject, will pick up a book and say, okay, I don't just need a book that tells me what happened. I also want someone to offer their explanation for what happened. So I've tried to combine a narrative account with a more analytical approach in this book. And I think that there is an appetite for that kind of book now, given the size of the existing literature. So in order to do that, of course, I mean, I have my own tastes and my own research interests as an academic, and they tend towards history of ideas. And that's, I think, perfectly clear, particularly in the first few chapters of the book, where I talk about the origins of Nazism and the idea of Nazism as a movement and as an ideology. And I'm also interested in some regions of Europe more than others, and that's also, I think, fairly clear in the book. But I've tried to give a wide coverage of events as I can. Obviously, nobody can master all the literature. I mean, the fact that I said that the Holocaust was a pan-European crime, that means that if you restrict yourself to the scholarly literature, and if you restrict yourself within that to the history of the Holocaust, never mind sociology, law, philosophy, all the rest of it, if you restrict yourself to the history of the Holocaust, it's written in every language of Europe and beyond, of course. There's huge literature in Hebrew, obviously. Nobody can read all of the languages of Europe. I think it's fair to say that the scholarship is more developed in some countries than others. But even if you could read all of those languages, you wouldn't be able to read everything that is published. It's far too much. So you have, I think, one of the things I also wanted to do in this book was to try and provide a kind of guide to readers to say, here's where you need to look for up-to-date literature on X, Y, or Z, and on any particular topic. But in order to make this, I think, more of an interesting book, one of the things I wanted to do was to take on some of the, what I think of as the misconceptions or misperceptions about the Holocaust that prevail in the contemporary culture, and that do so perhaps despite and perhaps because of the ways in which the Holocaust is commemorated at a more popular as opposed to a scholarly level. And we can talk about that, because the two tracks are kind of often parallel each other, but don't always intersect. I mean, the scholarly approach to the Holocaust and the popular approach, commemoration and so on, they're often talking at cross purposes, and that's itself a bit of a problem. One that David Cesarani identified at the start of his final book, Final Solution, and one which I've also tried to address a little bit here. So what do I mean? I'll give you a few examples. The first one is that the Holocaust is not synonymous with Germans and Jews. And I think we've become used to, and we like, dealing with victims who look like us. And Anne Frank, of course, is the archetype of those kinds of victims. We're very familiar with the Holocaust in Western Europe, in Germany and in the Western European countries. But the number of victims from Western Europe as a whole was smaller than the number of Jews deported and killed from Warsaw. And so and we can talk about precise figures if you want. It's really important to understand the Holocaust in Western Europe, because if you don't think about it, you don't understand the scope of the Nazis' vision. It was important to them to deport the Jews of Denmark and Norway and so on, just as it was important for them to deport and kill the Jews of Poland. But the numbers involved were very, very small. The German Jews make up no more than about 4 or 5% of the total number of victims killed in the Holocaust. There were about 500,000 Jews in Germany in its pre-1933 borders, and about half of them emigrated before the war, before Jewish emigration was banned. A number of those, some tens of thousands, were caught because they'd moved to France and to the Netherlands, and were then caught, and, like the Frank family, were caught and rounded up and deported. But many had escaped to the UK and to the US and elsewhere. The vast majority of the victims killed in the Holocaust were Eastern European Jews, many of them, not exclusively, but many of them traditional Orthodox Jews, shtetl-dwelling and living in other small towns across what used to be the Pale of Settlement of the Tsarist Empire. So the border lands from the Baltic Sea through what's today Belarus, Ukraine, down to the Black Sea. And those people were shot. They were not killed in gas chambers. They were shot in face-to-face killings in pits on the edges of the towns in which they lived. About 1.5 million killed in those circumstances. And it's unsurprising that we think about the Western European Jews. We know more about them. We have huge amounts of source material about them. They tended, of course, to be more wealthy. This is a topic that is, I think, slowly returning to prominence in Holocaust studies, the question of social class and status and wealth in the context of the Holocaust. But the Western European Jews tended, on the whole, to be middle class, assimilated, whatever that means, often bourgeois, and they left behind films, photographs, documents, lots of material. When we talk about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, there are still somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million victims of the Holocaust whose names we don't even know. We know nothing about them, including whole communities that were simply wiped out in the Eastern European borderlands. So one of the things I've wanted to do is to try and shift our focus. I mean, scholars have been doing this for some years, but to shift our focus eastwards, not to the neglect of the Holocaust in Western Europe, but to say we can't only think about the German Jews or the Jews of the Netherlands or France when we talk about this process. So much for the victims. When it comes to Germans, this is also another problem. Germany is often upheld as a country that has successfully dealt with its own past. Indeed, the German term Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means the process of coming to terms with the past. I mean, German has a word that means the process of coming to terms with the past, is something that is supposedly a marker of contemporary German culture. And I think that's true to a very large extent. But there is a tendency within German memory culture to object to the sort of thing that I'm talking about here, which is to say, actually, this was a pan-European crime. There were many other perpetrators other than Germans. And there is a kind of tendency to say, no, the Germans were the perpetrators. We can't talk about anyone else. This is a problem, particularly in the current day, because we have governments like that in Poland, the right-wing Law and Justice Party, which have been passing laws trying to outlaw and prosecute historians who talk about the collaboration of Poles in the killing of Jews, and promoting instead a narrative about Polish Catholic rescue of their Jewish neighbors, which is, I mean, there is a history of that, but it's only, of course, part of the story of what happened in Poland. So if you say only the Germans were the perpetrators, by which, of course, I mean Germans and Austrians, we'll take that as read for the moment, you exclude a whole other group of perpetrators. And so I wanted to write, there is a chapter about collaborators in the book, and it was very important to me that should be there, because when I talk, collaboration is a difficult term to use because it connotes the opposite to resistance in the French sense. So where after the war, there was, of course, this myth in post-war France that everyone had been in the resistance, and that the collaborators had been dealt with. I don't want to say that when I talk about collaborators, I'm thinking only in terms of the distinction between collaborators and resistance set up by France. Actually, there were many varieties of collaboration, and this can range from the level of the state. So I'll talk about Romania in a moment. Independent countries that were, or quasi-independent countries that were under German control or tutelage, like Croatia, Slovakia, and elsewhere. Occupied countries where pro-German Nazi movements were installed in power, Norway, the Netherlands, and so on. And it can range then down to the level of institutions like the OUN that I mentioned, auxiliary police battalions across Eastern Europe, other Nazi movements, various movements within the Vichy regime in France, down to the level of the individual. People like the so-called Szmalcowniks in Poland, who betrayed Jews to the Gestapo with a quick, especially for men, quick trouser inspection, and which is why there are lots of more women survived passing as Aryan in Warsaw than men did. Not just because men were circumcised, but because often women in Poland had particular sets of skills that they'd learned. They often were more educated, spoke better Polish than the men did, who spoke they spent all their time, in yeshiva and breaking their backs, studying Torah, and unable to speak Polish without a Yiddish-inflected accent. So often women survived better in that respect, down to the level of peasants in Ukraine who robbed their Jewish neighbors' houses after they'd been deported, because they were all poor. The Jews might have been marginally less poor than the Ukrainian peasants were, and so the looting of pots and pans and such we can also see as a kind of collaboration in a way, if we want to. So I've tried to cover all of this. The most egregious example, and the one I think I'm going to write about in the future, is Romania. And I wanted to write about this because it's almost unknown, this in the English, this history in the English-speaking world. After the Wehrmacht, the Romanian army was the largest army to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, larger than the Italian, Hungarian, or other, certainly much larger than things like the Spanish Blue Division and so on. The Romanians had lost northern Transylvania to Hungary in 1940 as part of the Second Vienna Award. They'd already lost Bessarabia, what's today more or less the Republic of Moldova, to the Soviet Union, which had occupied it after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And under Marshal Antonescu, the Romanian fascist leader, who was himself a vicious anti-Semite and more or less, I think it's no problem to describe him here as a fascist. His invasion of the Soviet Union was also part of Hitler's crusade to eliminate Judeo-Bolshevism, but it was also for him a strategic move that he wanted to appease the Third Reich. And as he said, the road to Transylvania lies through Bessarabia. In other words, we invade the Soviet Union and sooner or later we'll get northern Transylvania back. And the Romanians did get northern Transylvania back. It's today part of Romania, but not because of that, but rather because the Romanians changed sides in 1944 and as a result were opportunistically became friends of the Soviets. But that's a different story, which we can talk about. But during their occupation of the part of Western Ukraine between the Dniester and Bug rivers that the Romanians called Transnistria, not to be confused with what today is Transnistria, which is the tiny strip of land east of the Dniester River in Moldova, which is pro-Russian and which is about to become a serious flashpoint in Eastern European affairs because the Russians are stirring up trouble there, in causing problems in Chisinau and in the region generally. The Romanians took the decision that they were going to deport the Jews from Romania and send them into the German-occupied Ukraine for them to deal with. And Jews, first of all, the Jews from Bessarabia and from Bukovina in the north, the newly acquired regions after World War I, where the Jews were less likely to be Romanian-speaking, a bit more foreign-looking, were deported first of all and sent to Transnistria. And when they got there, the Germans then declined to accept them across the Bug into German-occupied Ukraine. This has been the subject of some debate in the historiography, whether there was a Romanian plan to murder the Jews or not. I think there probably wasn't, but when the Germans declined to take the Romanian Jews and the local Jews from Transnistria, which included Odessa, into the region of German-occupied Ukraine, the Romanians then dumped them. They set up a series of ghettos and concentration camps. Mostly, when we think of a concentration camp, we think of somewhere like Dachau, fixed installations, barracks, barbed wire, and so on. This is not what these places look like. Most of them were former Soviet collective farms, often pigsties. There's I mean, from an anthropological point of view, the bizarre torture of housing Jews in pigsties is, of course, I don't need to explain what the problem is, but the Jews were dumped in sub-zero temperatures in places that had no shelter, no accommodation, and there were no plans to do anything with them. And so in places like Pechora, Vapniaka, and others, the Jews themselves had to create their own shelter and accommodation, and very quickly started dying in huge numbers from disease, malnutrition, and so on. And it's also the case that in a few of these places, some of the largest massacres of the Holocaust years took place. So I think everyone here is probably familiar with Babi Yar outside Kiev. But in Bogdanovka, which is a little village on the River Bug today in Ukraine, at the end of December and into January 1941-42, the Romanians were responsible for the murder of about 50,000 Jews there, shot face-to-face by Ukrainian auxiliaries, but under Romanian control. And in other places close by, Domanovka and Akhmechetka, there were also large-scale massacres. And these are names, I think, that have no resonance in the English-speaking world. There's a lot more. The Romanian historiography is less developed because of the peculiar history of post-communist Romania, communist and post-communist Romania, than its Hungarian or Polish counterparts. But there is quite a lot of work done on this now in terms of the local history of what happened in Transnistria, but it's still, I think, almost unknown in the English-speaking world. And Romania was not an occupied country. Romania was an independent state, albeit in the German orbit, but one that the Germans were reluctant to intervene in too much because they needed Romanian oil. And so for the duration of the war, Romania was very able to negotiate with Germany in terms of its own interests. And it did so. So after, towards the end of 1942, the Antonescu regime changed its mind about deporting the Jews. And so the Jews of Bessarabia and Bukovina had been deported. The local Jews who lived in Transnistria had all been killed. But the Jews of the so-called Regat, the old kingdom of Romania, around Wallachia and Moldavia, were not deported, which meant that the Jews of Bucharest were not deported. and the Jews in the Banat, in the west of the country, were also not deported, thanks also to interventions by local church leaders and Jewish leaders as well, who sent delegations to Bucharest to negotiate with the leaders of the Romanian regime in a way that would have been unthinkable in Berlin. So the Romanians changed their mind, and the Germans couldn't do anything about it, which means that at the end of the war, the largest surviving Jewish community in Europe was in Bucharest. Which is rather bizarre in a way. And there are, I quote Abakovna, famous as the partisan leader in here, who at the end of the war, when he reached Bucharest, suddenly had this strange feeling of almost resentment. He was really pleased to see this large Jewish community alive. And then there's this kind of bitterness, like, how did these people survive here, sort of on the edge of the crematoria just nearby? What happened here? And he struggles a little bit to make sense of it. And it's a history that's made even more unpleasant by virtue of the fact that communist Romania, particularly in the Ceausescu years, was perhaps second only to Enver Hoxha's Albania, the most brutal Stalinist regime in communist Eastern Europe, and was responsible for literally selling its Jews to Israel in the 1970s and 1980s, as the country became more and more what the Romanian dissident Norman Mania called national socialist. I mean, effectively, Romania in the 1980s under Ceausescu became a fascist regime, and existing with this kind of patina of communism, but underneath with this ethno-nationalist, exclusivist ideology. And given Romania's independent line vis-a-vis Moscow and its strange negotiations with the West in the 70s and 80s, the selling of Jews to Israel, and along with the selling of ethnic Germans in Romania to West Germany, was one of the few ways that the Ceausescu regime could raise hard currency in that period. So the Jewish community in Romania today is tiny, and I don't know Bucharest very well, but in Timișoara in the west, the Jewish community there is tiny, and it's but extremely interesting. It's a fascinating story. So I wanted to write more about Romania, and I think I will do in future as well. The second thing I wanted to mention. How long have I got? I can talk for hours and hours, but I'll carry on a little bit longer. The second thing I wanted to say in the book was really, and I think this is really still a problem in the popular imagination, is that concentration camps are not synonymous with the Holocaust. I think that's something that we still hear a lot. Actually, the Nazi concentration camp system, as it was established in 1933 with Dachau, was established, I think people know, first of all, to do away with what the Nazis perceived as their de facto enemies, political enemies. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, etc. There were Jews among them, of course, and as Jews, they received generally rougher treatment in the concentration camps than their non-Jewish counterparts. But they were not there because they were Jews. The expansion of the camp system in the mid-30s was to clear Germany of unesthetic elements, so-called asocials, beggars, vagrants, prostitutes, alcoholics, and so on, people that the Nazis didn't want on the streets, particularly not during the Olympic Games. The first time that Jews were in the concentration camps in large numbers was in November 1938, after the November pogrom, Kristallnacht. And the 10,000 men that were sent to Buchenwald and Dachau and Sachsenhausen were there for a few months at most, and then allowed to leave on the promise that they would then leave the country, which of course they did, because they didn't need any further encouragement, after being fleeced, of course, of all their property. The death camps, the Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, were outside of the SS's official inspectorate of concentration camps. Auschwitz and Majdanek are the two exceptions, which combined the function of concentration camps and death camps and slave labor camps. But in general, the camps that I think we think of as archetypal Holocaust camps actually were not. That's not what they were established for. When we think of Dachau and Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and particularly Belsen at the end of the war, we think of those as places of where the Holocaust took place. But actually, the large numbers of Jews at those camps at the end of the war were there because they were survivors of the evacuations, the so-called death marches of camps from further east. So as the Red Army advanced, Himmler gave an order to the camps to say the camp inmates should not fall alive into enemy hands. And so we have this bizarre phenomenon of the death marches, which is also a phenomenon that hasn't really been written about properly, I think, in the synthetic histories of the Holocaust. And I've tried to do so a bit in this book, and I co-curated an exhibition at the Wiener Holocaust Library on death marches 2 years ago now, on that subject, to try and make a bit more sense of what was happening during the death marches. It's a very strange phenomenon, but Belsen at the end of the war, particularly Belsen, as opposed to the other camps, was functioning like a death camp. It's perfectly understandable why survivors and historians thought that Belsen was a death camp. The vast majority of about 50,000 inmates who died at that camp died in the final couple of months of its existence, as it became a total disaster zone. The deliberate cutting off of food and water supplies meant that when the British Army arrived, there were 10,000 corpses on the streets of the camp, and somewhere in the region of 60,000 dying inhabitants. It's phenomenal when you read. I think some of the hardest source material to read on the Holocaust comes actually from the liberation of the camps, where you read accounts of the dead and the living mixed in together in barracks covered in shit, and it's very, very hard to read, and remains so no matter how many times you read about it. The survivors also often wrote about those camps as if they were the worst camps that they'd ever been in. And I don't think we should contradict them. But institutionally speaking, Belsen, for example, was not set up as a death camp. None of those camps were set up as death camps. They didn't have gas chambers. People died in them in large numbers at the final stages of the war. And had the liberating armies arrived just a couple of days or a couple of weeks later, the numbers of dead in them would have been far higher than they actually were. But the other thing here that I wanted to write about that was relevant is the sub-camp system of the main camps. And the image on the book I chose, it's from a book published in Paris about Auschwitz in 1946, and it has these very beautiful line drawings. And I chose this one of women performing slave labor because it's an unusual image that we don't often associate with the Holocaust, which we think of quite rightly as a killing process. But towards the end of the war, when the German war economy was in dire straits, the Germans started to use Jewish and non-Jewish, but the surprising thing I think is that they used Jewish camp inmates to perform slave labor. They didn't treat them like a proper workforce. I mean, I think if you want people to work for you, you should at least, I suppose, feed and house them. And the Nazis treated the Jewish slave laborers as if there was a constant supply of them. And so the numbers, the productivity, if we have to think in those terms, was extremely poor. Nevertheless, being taken from either the Łódź ghetto in the summer of 1944 or from Auschwitz and moved from Auschwitz to one of the small sub-camps, of which there were about 1,000 across Europe at the end of the war, meant for many of the young women and men, and often only children, they were figured as men and women in the Nazi documents, but many of them were aged 14 to 18, meant that they were in slightly better physical state than they might otherwise have been, and some of them were able to survive the rigors of the death marches and the liberation period. So in a bizarre way, the sub-camp system kept people alive. It was not designed for that. They were basically the dead on leave. These were people whose deaths were simply being deferred until Nazi Germany won the war. But the chaotic nature of what happened at the end of the war meant that they survived. And I'll end by just saying, how do we know so much about this? One of the reasons is that we now have access to an archive in this country, which is the International Tracing Service archive. Some of you may have come across it doing genealogical research. That's probably what it's best known for. The archive changed its name to the Arolsen Archives a couple of years ago because it's based in a town called Bad Arolsen in Hesse in central Germany. It has a very interesting institutional history. It was set up as a tracing service by the Allies at the end of the war, was then fought over by different bodies until 1955, when it was handed over by the military authorities to the International Committee of the Red Cross, who administered it and ran it as a tracing service until 2007, when it was open to the public and the Red Cross stood down from its running of this archive. Throughout all those decades, the Red Cross always said, it's just a tracing service, there's nothing much of interest for historians in this archive. After extreme pressure in the 1990s, when they were forced to open the archive, it turns out that there are 30 million documents in there. That's about 25 kilometers of shelving. It's the largest archive of material relating to Nazi persecution in the world. That means not just the Holocaust, not just the murder of the Jews, but there's material in there relating to over 17.5 million individuals who were victims of Nazi persecution. So Nazi camps, Nazi prisons, the regular prison service, and across the whole of Europe. It's phenomenal what's in there. Original material from the concentration camps, material from the post-war period, from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the forerunner of the UNHCR, the International Refugee Organization, and there are about 3 million so-called TD files, tracing and documentation files. So whenever somebody has sent in a request to trace a missing loved one since the end of the war, the ITS opened a file on that person. Most of them are very thin, because nothing can be found. But in successful cases, and successful in ITS terms means found alive or dead, where you have a conclusive answer as to what happened to that person, some of the files can be very fat indeed, with testimonies, photographs, all sorts of documents. Simply to see it in the flesh is extraordinary. It's actually, it's been inscribed on UNESCO's Register of World Memory because it is effectively a memorial to the dead. It's breathtaking to see it. And the material in there is really remarkable, and if you want to read more, you can read my next book, which is coming out in July, which is on the International Tracing Service, and has been a long time in coming, because I can't claim to have read 30 million documents, but I did my best over a period of some years. So the material in there is from the wartime years, documents produced by the Nazi regime and collaborating regimes, but there's very little in there about the so-called Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe. There's not much there about Auschwitz. There's not much there about the Reinhard camps. But when it comes to the concentration camps and the slave labor camps in Germany proper, especially towards the end of the war and the liberation period and the displaced persons camps, there's a vast amount of information, and we can read the sources in a way against the grain and turn them from being perpetrator documents into ways of tracing the trajectories of individuals through the Nazi camp system in a way that is very fine-grained and very different from many other archives. So I guess I should stop there. I'm happy to talk much more about any of those things, but I think it's time maybe for questions before people start to get too bored.
I know that some at home will have lots of questions, Nicola. Hopefully you can, if you can't type, I'll come to you in a few moments. But firstly, anybody in here have a question? I do. I've got lots. Go on, Angela.
I just wanted to clarification. Looking at the paper I spoke to you about in Belgium, it struck me that was a labour camp initially.
Mm-hmm.
Then I read that it had 3 gas chambers in all the buildings, and then I read it was expanded to 6 as a concrete building. And it took the Jews from Lvov and the 6 on the roads.
Yep.
So was it at the Wannsee conference that the concept of the camp as a concentration camp to kill Jews, that was where that concept came from, right?
No.
So the question, just in case people didn't hear from home, so the question is around Belzec and the nature of it, following Dan's talk about what is a concentration camp or death camp and what's not.
Okay. The reason why Wannsee was not the place where the final solution was decided on, I think is now fairly clear in the historiography. There was, in the literature, there's always been a debate between so-called intentionalists and functionalists. So intentionalists who believe that the Nazis always intended to kill the Jews, whether from 1920 or 1925 when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, etc., or the functionists who say this is a policy that was ad hoc, reactionary, made on the hoof. There was no clear plan; it just kind of happened. They don't necessarily deny the fact that the Nazi regime was anti-Semitic, but they say this wasn't a worked out plan in advance. I would say now that the evidence, I talk about a kind of incipient genocidal fantasy, which is inherent to Nazi ideology from the beginning. But there was no blueprint to murder the Jews, I think, until 1941, summer or autumn of 1941. And in an intentionalist viewpoint, there was a contradiction, because the argument was that Hitler had always intended to kill the Jews, but that Wannsee was the place where the decision to kill the Jews was made. It's like, well, if the Nazis had always intended to kill the Jews, what did they need the Wannsee Conference for? And so the question then is, well, okay, what was it for then? And I think the answer to that really is that this is the moment when Himmler, represented at the Wannsee meeting by Heydrich and his deputy Eichmann, basically gathered together representatives from many of the main Nazi agencies, but more importantly from the civil service, agencies that were not part of the Nazi party, but from the Ministry of Justice and so on, and basically told them that the SS was now in charge of this process and that they were going to fall into line and get them to agree. So it was a kind of sharing of complicity, but also an enforcement of SS control. Because up until that point, officially Goering had been in charge of the Jewish question. But in July 1941, there's this famous document where he transfers control of the Jewish question to Heydrich, itself a document that I think he didn't necessarily write voluntarily, but the SS, you can imagine them kind of giving him this document saying, you please sign this, and you save a bit of face, and we'll make it look as though you are delegating this project to us. But what you see throughout the war is the rise of the power of the SS as a kind of state within a state in Nazi Germany. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the film Conspiracy, which is about the Wannsee Conference, is one of the few mockumentaries about the Holocaust, which is brilliant. It's filmed in the Wannsee Villa. It's only an hour long. It's a film. It's about the 15 men sitting around the table in the Wannsee Villa and what happens there. And of course, there's a bit of poetic license. We don't know exactly what the conversation was, but it's totally convincing and it's chilling. And Kenneth Branagh plays Heydrich, and I can't think about Heydrich without seeing Kenneth Branagh. He's so brilliant. And there's a moment in the film where, I mean, we don't know this exactly from the historical record, but where one of the civil servants, I can't remember whether it's Stuttgart or one of the others, slightly objects to what Himmler wants to do. Not that he objects to the killing of the Jews, but he wants it to be done legally and properly and so on. And Himmler, they go for a little walk after lunch, and Himmler says to him, we've got no shortage of meat hooks for those who oppose us. And we don't know that he said that, but it's totally chilling and it's totally convincing. And so I think what you see at Wannsee is simply the SS stamping its control on the process. And I think we're able to say that because actually Belzec was already being constructed when Wannsee took place. It started operating just shortly afterwards. And you can't set up a death camp within a week or two, right? So it was already being built before Wannsee took place. And the Langer, who was the SS, or Jekyll, who was the SS man in charge of Latvia, reported back at the Wannsee conference to say that Latvia was now free of Jews. And so the Holocaust as a process beyond the shooting of Jews in Eastern Europe and as a continent-wide program, was already being thought through before Wannsee took place.
Thank you very much indeed. I know. If we have time to do that, we'll do that. But Nicolette, I know you're desperate to ask something.
Can you hear me first?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I'm pleased to speak to you, Professor, as an old Hollowegian, very old. But my question really, it seems a bit obscure, having listened to your excellent expose, but I was thinking of a remark by Hannah Arendt, and I think she was talking about personal morality, personal responsibility. And she says somewhere, and I can't remember where because I'm old and forgetful, but she says that lives could have been saved if the Jewish councils had not collaborated. with the Nazis. Now, I've read plenty of Holocaust.
Nicolette, have you got a question?
Yeah, well, that is it.
That's
Do
the
you
question.
think
Okay.
that any lives could have been saved? Because I've never read a Holocaust historian who said that there could have been.
I kind of do. I mean, she said that in Eichmann, the Eichmann book,
Eichmann
right?
trial.
The Eichmann in Jerusalem is where she said that. And of course, the problem with the statement is that it's counterfactual, right? We don't know. But we do have evidence from the time that suggests that people then were thinking about it. And I cite in this book an example of a Polish Jew who escaped to Hungary and was quite close to the Jewish leadership in Budapest during the war, and who said to them, you need to not agree to set up Jewish councils. And their response was, yeah, but then there'll be chaos. And his response is that chaos is exactly what we need. That it'll be harder for the Germans, they'll still kill lots of us, but we won't be involved in the process. Now, I think my take on this is that Arendt was probably correct to that extent. I would not agree, and I'm not sure this is what she says actually, I would not agree that the Jewish councils collaborated with the Nazis. I mean, this is where collaboration becomes a very difficult term. I mean, they collaborated in the sense that they worked with and did what the Nazis wanted. But when you read, for example, the minute books from the Białystok Jewish Council, or even the documents from Łódź, where Rumkowski is of course a hate figure. Nevertheless, the people who worked in the Jewish councils did what they thought was the best thing for the Jews in the ghettos, and they were working within a framework that was not of their own making and that they couldn't understand fully. So the historian Dandina talks about counter-rationality when explaining the Jewish councils. That's to say that the Jewish council's decision-making process made sense to them in the framework that they were given, but they couldn't have known that what they were doing ultimately was contributing to the Nazis' program to kill all the Jews.
Thank
But
you.
Hungary with
you, Nicolette.
Gessner is perhaps an exception there, do you think?
We'll come back to it, Nicolette, just because I want to make sure that other people have got the opportunity to ask some questions as well. So.
I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what this means of the mismatch between what you're talking about, which is absolute essence, and the kind of narrative that gets taught in schools.
Yeah.
Which I was really interested because I said it's part of Holocaust learning in the UK, and education in schools. But it feels like there's this gap that catching up education is quite difficult.
Just to repeat the question I think this was going to be my question as well, because you write about it quite powerfully and forcefully. And for us as a synagogue congregation and people involved in Holocaust education, so important to hear your thoughts on it. So the mismatch, the question was around the mismatch between Holocaust commemoration in education, and I'd extend that out to synagogues in our services and what we do as well, and then the academic.
It's a really hard question because I'll make my excuses first, right? I'm not a pedagogue in the sense that I'm not. I don't do like the theory of pedagogy. I don't teach school kids. I try to avoid, my children's school finding out who I am. I don't mind talking to sixth formers. I can just about manage that. But any younger than that, I don't quite know how to, because I just want to talk about how things were. And I generally feel that teaching the Holocaust to younger kids is problematic in one of two ways. Either you traumatize children by telling them stuff they don't necessarily need to know, especially when it comes to the murder of 1.5 million Jewish children by the Nazis, or you kind of beautify the Holocaust and leave out things in order to make it palatable for children. And that's also problematic, of course. And I say, having said that, I know that a huge amount of effort and work goes into Holocaust education at school levels. And I know this because I am involved with the Institute of Education, and I talk to teachers and do CPD lectures and so on for teachers to try and bridge this gap between what scholars are doing and what schools are doing. And it's a problem, of course, because teachers have got a lot of things to teach. And they can't all become Holocaust historians or experts on the subject, and why should they? So it's very much a question about how it's taught, in which context, do you teach it in religious studies, do you teach it in history, ethics classes, etc., etc. What context is it taught in, and what do you want to achieve by teaching it? I think this is the big problem. I would argue, if you're going to teach it to school children, you teach it to older children, you teach it in history, like any other historical topic. And if you teach it with a kind of moralistic intent that assumes that Holocaust education is going to combat anti-Semitism, or is going to combat the occurrence of genocide in the world, or is even going to make children into nicer people, I think that's very optimistic.
But it's also my question is also about the mismatch.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in education, I think, is that there are bits that culturally get stuck, like the emphasis on Western Europe.
Yes.
Which might also be because our geography in
Yeah.
Western Europe is very poor, and the names are really hard to say. So,
Yes.
So, if I'm teaching quick,
Yes.
I'm not a teacher,
Yes.
that will be easy. But also, you've got 10 minutes and then assembly. So you'll
Exactly.
something like that.
I know. I mean, having said that, I wonder how many school teachers pronounce names of places in the Netherlands correctly, or in Norway. But I of course completely take that point. I think that's right. The problem is, it's such a complicated history. When you think about the different places, the geography of it, the languages, everything to do with it, even just understanding Jews as victims. What on earth does that mean? Jews as the Nazis defined them, Jews as they themselves defined themselves, 1,000,001 different Jewish groups, religiously, socially, economically, etc. It's very, very complicated. And to try and do this justice, as you say, in a 10-minute assembly is really problematic.
We are at the end of our time, and I know that we timed things to enable people to watch the National Memorial as well. So people are free to go. I know that one or two may have another couple of questions that you might like to ask Dan as well in a few moments' time. Tomorrow evening we have our commemoration, and we'll try and do justice to it at 5 p.m. For anybody who would like to come into the synagogue to join me, please feel free to do so. And at the same time, we will be online as well. And I know that the link was sent out to join us on Zoom as well. But I just wanted to reiterate that I found the book brilliant. I know you're brilliant anyway, but now, your presentation this evening and the way that all of us have been incredibly captivated just goes to prove that factually as well. So thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you very much.
Not just because you're family, but because you're brilliant.
Thank you very much.
So we'll see everybody online. We will also put the video online for the rest of the congregation as well. I'm sure we get lots of, I know my daughter, etc., has already asked for a recording of it so that we can see. But thank you also very, very much indeed. Good evening, and maybe I'll see you tomorrow evening when we'll have some more commemoration rather than thinking and ideas. Laletov.